Fernwood was a quiet village where gossip could be heard over the hedge or shared at the Women's Guild. The dogs were well behaved and the hedges were neatly trimmed. On a Tuesday afternoon, Miss Marple accepted the Reverend's invitation to tea. At the vicarage, the event was a small gathering to welcome a new resident, Mrs. Eliza Vansor. Greystones had been empty since Colonel Hetherington's death, which had been described in the newspapers as natural causes. While passing out sponge cakes, the vicar's housekeeper, Miss Hartnell, said something along the lines of very hush-hush, adding, "But I suppose some people like their privacy." As she delicately sipped her tea, she examined Mrs. Fanshawe, who appeared slightly too serious with her slightly too scripted smile. Her tone was neither appreciative nor skeptical, but subtly reflective. While the subject of discussion veered between the unkempt rose beds at Greystones and the excellence of the local honey, Miss Marple's focus remained fixed on the honoured guest, Mrs. Fanshawe. It was noticeable that, unlike some women, Mrs. Fanshawe wore gloves indoors. However, the manner in which she flexed her fingers beneath the lace gave the impression that she was uneasy in her own skin. Across from her, Miss Partridge, who oversaw the Fernwood post office, leaned forward and said, "So sorry to hear about your husband's accident." It must have been quite a surprise for Mrs. Fanshawe. As the tea was served, the conversation resumed its course, veering back to the bake sale and the recent controversy surrounding foxes in the garden. By the time everyone had finished their tea, most had completely forgotten about the incident. However, later that evening, as Miss Marple walked home through the peaceful lanes of Fernwood, she paused at the edge of the village green. From far away, she could faintly hear a bell ringing, which seemed like an echo of a long-forgotten memory attempting to resurface. Upon turning around, she saw nothing, so she continued on her journey home, a slight furrow between her teeth. The next morning, Fernwood awoke to news that would spread faster than fresh cream on a scone. Mrs. Eloise Fanshawe was found dead in her drawing-room, sitting upright as if she had simply dozed off. No signs of a struggle, no broken teacups or shattered vases, just silence, and a clock stopped at precisely 9:14. It was Miss Partridge who found her come to deliver a misplaced telegram. She was just sitting there, she kept saying, as though she'd never moved, "But I knocked. No answer. The bell didn't ring, not the first time, only the second like. She heard me late." Miss Marple listened quietly. She didn't say much, not yet, but she remembered the slight tremble in the teacup. And she remembered the silence that called twice. Chapter 2, the morning after Mrs. Fanshawe's death. Fernwood hummed with restrained panic like bees in a sealed jar. Word of her sudden passing had already trickled through the ivy-covered cottages and narrow footpaths growing thornier. With each retelling, by midday, the village had split into camps at the greengrocer's. There were those who believed it had been her heart, and those who swore by poison. Mrs. Revington, who had just moved in a few short weeks, appeared too young to die in such a manner. Last night, I told Colin that something about her eyes didn't sit right. Miss Hartnell, who was in queue behind her, tutted softly. She seemed to have secrets which she kept to herself. Neither she nor the Vice's cat ever attended church, and neither did the Vice's cat. Old Mr. Jenkins, who she was found by Miss Partridge. "Yes," Inspector Denham inquired, jotting down a note. He was a towering figure with a scraggly moustache, the type that flaunted his authority like a spotless uniform. The vicar responded by saying, "She's deeply disturbed." There was no trace of forced entry, and Miss Marple sat silently in the corner with her knitting bag closed on her lap. She had known Inspector Denham for years, and he was an honest man, if a little too quick. to draw neat conclusions. While the attending physician acknowledged that the cardiac arrest was somewhat abrupt. We will have to wait for the post-mortem results and the exact time of death to confirm his suspicions. According to the stopped clock, Miss Marple gently calculated that it would be between 9 and 10 in the evening. Maybe Greystones don't run on electricity, someone speculated, citing a power surge. I think Miss Marple said that the vicar was absent-mindedly frowning, wearing denim, and using gaslighting candles. The housekeeper, who had only been employed for a week, barely knew her employer. Mrs. Fanshawe was described as being old-fashioned or cautious. A moment of silence ensued as Denham turned the page. "And the cause of death remains natural?" the vicar inquired, his expression betraying his hope. "For now," Denham said, "we'll question the villagers, if only to settle nerves." It was a typical afternoon for Miss Marple to sit at the tea-room window, a peaceful spot on Church Lane, as the clouds rolled in over Fernwood. Instead of ordering tea, she just listened as Mrs. Crawford, who ran the dressmakers, leaned in towards Miss Partridge, who was sitting at the table across from her. Miss Partridge seemed to be nodding, as if she had just dozed off. I knocked twice, but only the second one resounded. And that's when I realized something was amiss. Mrs. Crawford commented on how strange it was that no one had heard a scream or anything. Miss Marple turned to smile kindly at them. "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Partridge seemed a bit off-kilter, and I remember Mrs. Fanshawe saying that the moonlight helped her sleep. The bell, with Miss Marple's light tone and unfocused eyes, didn't ring the first time, which seemed strange considering it had worked fine the day before. However, when I knocked again, she said, "Well then it did." In Chapter 3, the rain lingered all night and into the next morning, casting long grey shadows across the landscape. Miss Marple nodded in curiosity as she slowly rose and said her goodbyes. She stepped into the lane, her eyes tracing patterns most would never see. Across the square, at the gates of Greystones, a boy stood with a catapult in his back pocket. Watching the manor, when he caught Miss Marple's eye, he turned and ran. Fernwood liked to pretend its silences were peaceful, but Miss Marr, because of the rain, people stayed indoors and were more likely to talk by mid-morning. Miss Marple quietly visited Greystones, not for any official reason, because that would be inappropriate, but to bring lavender sachets for the housekeeper. Elsie, the timid housekeeper, accepted the sachets with wet eyes and thanked Miss Marple for thinking of her. She hadn't been in the room since the constables left. Miss Marple offered to sit with Elsie in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. Miss Marple gently asked if Elsie had ever spoken about her late husband, who died abroad from complications related to a staircase. Elsie hesitated before shaking her head in disbelief. Elsie admitted that she rarely spoke about anything other than the bell. "I thought it was simply a habit, you know, some city wave that the bell had to ring twice to be heard as." Miss Marple stared up at it, fussy about it. Ellie looked perplexed. The rain had loosened the soil in the back garden, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes continued to scan the area. Underneath the hydrangeas, there was a shallow footprint too small to be a man's. Too muted to see the tread, but fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching through the window. As she leisurely made her way home, she strolled past the post office. Miss Partridge was incredibly fast at sorting mail, and a girl in a yellow raincoat waited patiently for stamps. "You were quite close to Mrs. Fanshawe, I believe," Miss Marple replied in a friendly tone. "I thought it was from a solicitor," Miss Partridge said, her jaw clenching. She seemed startled by it, Never posted a reply as far as I know. Threw it into the drawer like it burned her fingers. We spoke occasionally. Did you recall if she sent or received many letters? Miss Marple filed that away, burned fingers. Indeed, later that afternoon, the inspector called on Miss Marple himself. Do you mind, Miss Marple? Denham asked, standing in her parlour, brushing rain from his hat-eyed. Appreciate your thoughts. I thought you valued hard evidence more than village musings, Inspector, but your musings are often incredibly accurate, which is frustrating. She calmly offered him tea and listened as he described the pathologist's initial findings. No toxins, no injuries, no heart irregularities. But he did notice something strange. The patient's temperature was lower than expected when Miss Partridge discovered her, which could mean that she died earlier than originally believed, prior to the second knock. Then Denham hesitated, before continuing, You think that matters? Miss Marple spoke more to herself than to him. The inspector seemed to have adhered rigidly to a predetermined schedule, and the subject stated, I think silences can be timed. That night, Miss Marple got back to her knitting, but this time her needles were moving at a snail's pace. A lady's life passes unnoticed. A doorbell rings once. A footprint appears in damp dirt. And a letter that remained with one woman forever remains in her memory. In Chapter 4, the villagers whispered rumors of murder, but no official cause of death had been announced. The word poison circulated like a secret recipe, and, as was typical of Fernwood, the rumors became the truth after repeated hearing them. However, in the silences between sentences, glances, and unfinished gestures, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of what seemed like truth. Thus, Inspector Denham did not return to Greystones without a suspect in tow, accompanied by a constable. As they crossed paths on the green, Joseph Barnes, a gardener in his late 20s, kept to himself, had a record of petty theft, a couple of drunken brawls, and served time in his youth. He worked at Greystones until last week, when Miss Marple asked him a question, her voice light, but her eyes fixed on a squirrel scurrying up an elm nearby. Barnes dismissed the question, saying something about broken tools or a disagreement. We found his fingerprints on the gate latch, which indicated that he returned the morning after she died, claiming he left something behind. The timing was curious, and he hasn't been seen since. Fernwood didn't have fugitives, but people here tended to stay exactly where they should, often for far longer than they should. A considerate nod was extended by Miss Marple. When the man flees, it's because he's guilty or because he knows no one will believe him. Denham didn't seem convinced that his brother in Holly might know where he's hiding that afternoon. The constables searched the hedge and asked pointed questions in town, while Miss Marple took a more subdued route. She visited Mrs. Rivington under the pretense of borrowing a particular brand of plum preserves. Oh, that Barnes boy. Mrs. Rivington sniffed. As she poured tea, he's always had a temper, never looked anyone in the eye. Did Mrs. Fanshawe ever mention him? She complained about him often, said he trampled her beds, and was careless with pruning. Though I think he frightened her more than she let on. I remember once at the market she spotted him and turned straight round without buying a thing, left her basket behind. Miss Marple gently stirred her tea, and yet she kept him on until last week. Mrs. Rivington blinked. Well, perhaps she pied him. Pity is a peculiar motivator. Don't you think? The conversation moved on, but Miss Marple's mind remained anchored later as dusk settled. She walked past the schoolhouse and noticed young Danny Peel, the boy with the slingshot, hunched near the gate with his bicycle. You've mud on your cuffs, Danny, she said mildly, stopping beside him. Rained yesterday. He mumbled, indeed, and before that. The afternoon you were watching Greystones. He raised his eyes sharply. It's normal to be curious about people, but sometimes it can be misconstrued. Dany averted her gaze as she caught sight of him. That morning he hadn't gone inside, but rather stood by the wall. Did he appear scared? Dany hesitated, but Miss Marple reassured him that he wasn't angry. Anger can be a mask for guilt, grief, or even fear. Later that night, the vicarage telephone rang, and Miss Marple, who had been visiting the Reverend with a borrowed man, stepped in. Upon listening to the inspector's voice, we discovered Barnes Denham hiding in the stables behind Harrow Road. He denies killing her, but refuses to explain his presence. We will detain him for the time being. Miss Marple remained silent for an extended while after the phone ended, instead gazing out the window. As the moon ascended over the fences, everyone in the town had their favourite scapegoat, but Miss Marple was well aware that the appearance of guilt seldom matched the reality. Section 5, as the Ville's favourite villain, Joseph Barnes had long been a source of suspicion. Despite Miss Marple's pleasant greetings and polite nods during her walks through Fernwood, she didn't appear particularly convinced. Instead, she listened more intently. For example, she took note of the way Miss Partridge spoke about him at the post office, a man who never said thank you and whose handwriting was so difficult to read, and wondered if Mrs. Fanshawe had corresponded with him. The inquiry was posed gently by Miss Marple, as if it had just occurred to her. Miss Partridge hesitated, saying, "I never saw that brown envelope she received. It was untidy and scrolled." Miss Marple grinned slightly, but it seemed more common for officers to send brown envelopes than gardeners. She thanked her and headed towards Greystones instead of the village green. The constables had already left, but the housekeeper remained to keep things flowing, even though it was unclear what was to be said in a house where the woman had died. As she opened the door, her face betrayed her exhaustion, and a small stain of flour stained her apron. She elaborated by saying, "I'm baking," using the phrase, "helps the nerves." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and asked if it would be too much trouble for her to return to the drawing room for a few minutes. The room was exactly as described, with the exception of the body being absent. The clock on the mantel remained silent, its hands frozen at 9:14. On the side table, she found a stack of books neatly arranged. At the top, she found a copy of The Way of All Flesh, which she opened halfway through. A pressed flower marked the page, which had wilted, but unmistakably said, "Forget-me-not." As she turned the book over, she noticed faint indentations on the page beneath it, as if someone had written on paper. She took a small pencil from her purse and gently stroked the pages to uncover the hidden message. For what seemed like an eternity, Miss Marple sat silently, closing the book. Elsie was downstairs, singing softly. The tune was off-key, but familiar because she needed dough. As Miss Marple ascended the stairs, her singing voice whispered, "Tell me." "Elsie, did Mrs. Fanshawe keep a desk in the study?" Elsie said, though she didn't write much, said she didn't have anyone to send letters to anymore, except the one she received. Elsie's hands paused over the dough. "She didn't like that letter," she said. "I asked when I brought in her tea. She said it was nothing, and then told me not to go near her desk again, and you didn't." Elsie looked briefly ashamed, just once, curiosity. "I thought she might need help writing back, but the drawer was locked." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the crisp afternoon light. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she took the long path behind the church where she found Reverend Collier tending to the winter bulbs. She waited until he stood and wiped his hands before speaking. "You knew the Fans from before, I believe?" she asked. He blinked only vaguely. "Met Mr. Fanshawe once, years ago, aboard a conference in Florence." not the most personable man, and Mrs. Fanshawe, she seemed weighed down, kind, but closed, as though something followed her with a serious nod. Miss Marple asked, "Do you know if she kept a will?" "I performed a reading yesterday," the Reverend said with a straight face. "She left the house to a cousin in Devon, a woman named Clara Hemsley. They hadn't spoken in years. It was an odd choice, but sometimes the most deliberate choices are the hardest." Miss Marple whispered under her breath as the sun curved below the clouds. After returning home, Miss Marple sat serenely at her window, observing the wind's rippling effects on the hedges, a long-lost relative, an unfinished threat, a letter that instilled fear but accomplished nothing, and a woman who passed away. At 9:14, seconds before an unanswered doorbell, the town of Fernwood felt no lighter at the end of the week, even though the rain had ceased. Something stirred that evening, not wrath nor panic, but fear. Miss Marple knew that fear frequently left traces in stillness. Joseph Barnes remained in custody, refusing to speak about his time at Greystones. He only offered repeated denials of guilt, but Miss Marple suspected something else entirely. Meanwhile, Fernwood turned inward, the tea-room became quieter, and conversations that had been lively now leaned toward whispers. Secrets hated the light, and too many had started to stir. On Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple was invited, if not directly, then quite deliberately, to Lady Clara Weatherby's drawing-room for a formal affair, ostentatiously disguised as social tea. Everyone in Fernwood knew that Lady Clara rarely entertained without a reason, so I hadn't invited anyone other than close friends. After all the rudeness, the guests were already familiar with Miss Marple, who patted her short hair with one hand while pouring Earl Grey. I felt a little respect would go a long way. The Partridge family, Lady Crawford of the dress industry, Dr. Edmund Lysander, a tall, mild-mannered man who had recently taken over Dr. Pendleton's practice, and the cheerful Miss Hartnell were the only people I saw Mrs. Fanshawe with. He spoke softly to her when the inevitable topic of the pharmacy came up, and she asked for something to calm her nerves, but she never followed through. What a strange woman. I think Miss Marple said something, but maybe it was about something specific, because Miss Hartnell was always looking over her shoulder as if someone was watching. Lady Clara smiled tightly. "Oh, you know, drifters, widows, and individuals without ties tend to stir things up, aren't they?" Dr. Lysander arched an eyebrow, implying just that. Joseph Barnes is a prime example of that. Tragedies seem to follow some guys wherever they go. In agreement, Miss Partridge nodded. "Do you know he once threatened the milkman over a bottle, saying he was being cheated?" Miss Marple gently said, "People say a great deal when they're frightened." There was a beat of silence. Then Mrs. Crawford leaned in and asked, did anyone know she had a cousin? Hemsley, Clara. "I remember the name," Lady Clara remarked with a sniff. "From a scandal involving an inheritance, dispute some unpleasant business." "Oh," Miss Marple said in a casual tone, "and I can almost see her selling it." People like that don't often stick around when they're not desired, so Lady Clara blinked. Miss Marple observed her from the edge of her teacup. Occasionally, guests tend to linger longer than anticipated, particularly when they feel owed something. Subsequently, the topic of conversation turned to the vicarage roof's current condition and the impending spring events. But the silence, an unresolved tension of the moment remained. Later that day, Miss Marple went for a stroll around the garden behind her cottage, cutting down the last remaining branches of winter's delicate foliage. She thought of Clara Hemsley, who had not yet appeared, though the will had been read. She thought of the letter, its tone unfinished, its writer afraid, and she thought of Mrs. Fanshawe, whose silence had not been one of calm but of strain the next. Morning brought another disturbance. Elsie, the housekeeper, had discreetly departed from Greystones the night before, packing all of her belongings. The Reverend had left a note with the keys, explaining that she couldn't stay in the house any longer due to an unsettling feeling. Miss Marple appeared unsurprised. After all, people in Fernwood often fled for reasons they couldn't fathom. As Monday dawned, the village was unusually quiet, with no rain or wind. Instead, a gentle humming noise clung to the hedges and lingered in the deserted lanes. The kind of silence that followed waiting. Miss Marple was far from idle after her morning tea and a brief conversation with the vicar's wife about moles. In the vegetable patch, she made her way to the post office, where she noticed that young Maisie, who usually sorts packages, was absent. Miss Partridge had gone home, so Maisie explained a bit too quickly that she wasn't feeling well. Miss Marple nodded slowly, which was a relief, because there were no further questions. However, Marple lingered for a moment longer, asking Maisie if she remembered a large brown envelope addressed to Mrs. Fanshawe last week. Maisie frowned, thinking, yes, I remember, because it had no return address. Miss Partridge didn't want to deliver it herself, so she sent the paper boy. How odd. The inspector's motorcycle rolled back down the main road, this time stopping not at Greystones, but at the edge of the woods behind Harrow Road. That afternoon, Miss Marple thanked her and smiled gently. The boys had been playing in the area, constructing a makeshift den. However, when Inspector Denham arrived at Miss Partridge's house, he found nothing but her coat, handbag, and a recently scrubbed fire pit. He told Miss Marple that the evening could be anything, but if it were nothing, she would have responded that someone wouldn't. He halted, asking, then why run? After realizing that someone might have burned the denim paste, he speculated that the trees could have concealed the remains that Miss Partridge didn't want in her dustbin. She might not be responsible for the murder, Miss Marple whispered, but there are many faces to guilt, and shame is one of them. He let out a breath as he said, we discovered the will in Mrs. Fanshawe's study, but the desk drawer was forcefully locked. Whoever did it wasn't after neatness or the letter, though. Miss Marple briefly closed her eyes, as if listening for something unsaid. Miss Partridge saw an envelope that might have contained more than threats. She murmured something along those lines. It might have contained a confession. Denham scowled, and Miss Marple gazed out her window, past the street lamps, as if to say, no, not yet. Something older, something that had lingered that night. The lamps of Fernwood burned, and the curtains were drawn tighter. The village was unsettled by Miss Partridge's absence, not because she was beloved, but because she had always been there. Greystones remained untouched, the house remained silent, and the cousin from Devon had still not arrived. The silence surrounding the house didn't feel like mourning anymore. It felt like waiting. Chapter 8. There was an unsettling pattern to Fernwood's days, with peaceful interruptions punctuated by subtle discoveries as inconsequential as a misplaced book or scarf. Despite this, the villagers seemed to have become wary of their own stillness. Sitting in the corner of the vicarage library, Miss Marple sat with her knitting basket unpicked next to her. She had asked Reverend Collier to invite a few villagers for tea, nothing out of the ordinary, just a friendly gathering. It was a subtle way for her to influence events without making it seem like it had been entirely Reverend's idea. Care was taken when selecting the guests: Mrs. Crawford, Dr. Lysander, and Lady Clara Weatherby, 3 characters with evocative voices, keen intuition, and extensive memories, above all. 3 individuals who had communicated with Mrs. Fanson during her last week on Earth, as well as with one another. I do miss the clarity of winter, observed Lady Clara from the vicarage window. This early spring is unsettling. Everything blooms too fast. Yes, things do come up unexpectedly, Miss Marple said with a subtle smile, toward the end of their long period in the grave. A scowl spread across Lady Clara's face as she remained silent. Have the police confirmed anything new? Dr. Lysander inquired courteously. I've heard the post office is quite upset. As Mrs. Crawford put it, Miss Partridge was never one to flee. She once faced down a tax official with only her handbag and a poorly stapled ledger. As she passed the platter of biscuits, Miss Marple poured tea. Fear is not always born of guilt, my dear, she pointed out. Sometimes it's born of watching something go wrong and not stopping it. Lady Clara let out a little chuckle. Surely you don't mean her, she barely said a word to anyone. I suppose you believe that envelope held the answer, Lady Clara finally said. Oh no, Miss Marple replied softly, just a piece of the truth. But sometimes, even the smallest truth makes someone afraid enough to do something foolish. Miss Marple tilted her head, but she still saw enough to know something was wrong. Maybe even to think the envelope she burned was more dangerous in someone else's hands than her own. Then there was a thin and brittle silence. You seem to know a great deal. Dr. Lysander cleared his throat. Miss Marple, the thing that most people don't realize is how much they reveal when they attempt to conceal a pause is while more tea was being poured. Miss Marple remarked, I've always found it interesting how Mrs. Fanshawe used to ring the bell. Twice, that woman was peculiar in many ways, Lady Clara said swiftly, hoping that Miss Marple would respond. However, the bell didn't ring the first time. It was only on the second occasion that Miss Partridge knocked, which would make it nearly impossible to answer if the person had already died. Dr. Lysander scowled. Were you implying that someone else was in the house? Miss Marple said slowly that someone trusted someone who could silence a bell. So they drew the curtains and disappeared just as a second knock sounded. Meanwhile, Lady Clara steadied her teacup with one gloved hand, as if it rattled slightly against the saucer. Miss Marple's voice remained warm as she pointed to the freshly scrubbed fireplace. The question then arises, and who would that be? It seems that someone had access to the study, knew where Mrs. Fanshawe stored her files, and might have even visited before the letter arrived. Lady Clara inquired. Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Dr. Lysander. Tell me, doctor, what medicine would lower a patient's heart rate without immediate trace in a basic examination? His pupils dilate, perhaps a digital harness, or an overdose of barbiturates or sedatives, but accurate dosing is required. Miss Marple said almost absently, and who, aside from a physician, might grasp such things? Anyone trained in nursing, he said slowly, or someone who lived with disease. Miss Marple nodded. Or someone who had spent years caring for an ailing husband, someone who understands how to make a death appear natural. As time passed, the room remained silent. The doctor finally said, she knows something. Miss Marple lifted her knitting to respond. She always did. The trap hadn't snapped yet, but someone had heard the click. After Lady Clara left, Dr. Lysander and Mrs. Crawford remained unusually quiet. Of course, Clara said kindly, but do take care, dear. Fear, when carried too long, tends to act on its own whether we allow it or not. It rained again the next morning, as if Fernwood itself needed washing. Miss Marple stood outside Greystones. Beneath her umbrella, the gate had started to droop and the roses along the front wall hadn't been trimmed since Mrs. Fanshawe died. Time had settled here, but she was still not at peace. Inspector Denham arrived just as the rain lightened. "I suppose you've brought me out here for a reason," he said, his tone being one of resignation rather than annoyance. I had the house, still had something to say, according to Miss Marple. They entered, and despite the silence, Greystones didn't feel abandoned. The furniture was undisturbed, and the curtains were drawn, just like they had been that night. Miss Marple guided him to the study, and she asked, "Do you see this drawer?" The drawer was forced open crudely, as she had mentioned, but everything else in the house was purposeful. No one was careless when they murdered Mrs. Fanshawe, however. The perpetrator's desperate attempt to appear carefree complete with crossed denim arms was all part of a larger plot to mislead. However, panic does not wash fire grates or pack a suitcase before dawn. It's possible that she was searching for the letter, or maybe she had it and needed to remove something else. While I was there the first week, I noticed a small burned patch of carpeting near the fireplace. It could have been coal dust, but when I returned, I saw that it had been replaced, cut, and patched from beneath the hall runner. Denham scowled, and she knelt down gently. People burn things all the time, but those who replace them don't hide what they burnt. They hide how it was burned. The inspector was silent for a long moment, and I asked, "Do you think Miss Partridge set the fire?" "No." Miss Marple whispered gently, "She may have witnessed it, she may even have helped cover it, but she was not alone, and she was not the one who walked into this house the night Mrs. Fanshawe died. You always meant to come back to Grace. You were here the night of the murder, maybe even earlier. You waited until the letter arrived, then you used what you knew." Lady Clara stepped further into the room. "You have no proof," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice trailing off as they cautiously turned around as the creaking front door greeted them. "I wondered when you would ask me," Denham asked, her voice unreadable under her coat and gloves. "A soft?" echoed from Miss Marple. "No, but I understand. You and Eloise Fanshawe were once close-knot cousins, but friends but adversaries due to an inheritance dispute." Mrs. Crawford recalled that Eloise had used a borrowed name, Clara, to avoid the scandal, but you remembered, you waited. And when her husband died, you came to collect Clara's estate. You didn't deny it, and you expected a quiet life with the house. Instead, you received a letter likely from Eloise herself, a final refusal, reminder that Eloise had never forgotten what you had done all those years ago. Miss Marple took a step closer. "You didn't come here to kill her, at least not. At first, perhaps she threatened to expose you." The mantel clock struck 12 and then struck 0. "Lady Clara, I couldn't read Ara's expression." In a low voice, Miss Marple explained, "She never rang the bell because you were already inside. The second chime, which responded to Miss Partridge, was an uncontrollable accident." Lady Clara's eyes twitched briefly, as if she were about to reveal something to everyone. In a whisper, she threatened to undo everything, saying, "I never deserved it. I never meant to." Denham cautiously advanced. "What did you offer her?" After Clara mentioned feeling lightheaded, "I left her alone, but when I came back, she had already departed. I wanted some time to ponder, so I glanced down at something to sleep." There was a complete silence as Miss Marple remained silent. In Chapter 10, the village of Fernwood seemed to have finally let go of the tension that had built up over the past few weeks. The sky also appeared lighter, even though the trees had started to shed their winter leaves. In the garden behind Miss Marple's cottage, the first crocuses had poked their heads out, a sign that life would go on. Miss Marple, as usual, was sitting in the corner chair with her knitting basket by her side. The fire crackled gently, bringing warmth despite the afternoon chill. Standing by the window, Inspector Denham gazed out over the village as if he had never seen it before. "I've always wondered why you didn't just tell me your suspicions," he said, his voice betraying a mix of respect and frustration. "You knew, didn't you? From the start, you always knew the bell, the letter, the clues we overlooked." He turned to face her with a weary but sincere expression on his face. "I suspected much, Inspector, but I waited for you to see what I had seen. People frequently overlook the smallest details." Miss Marple responded that everything we needed was truth, including the bell, the fire, the missing envelope, and Lady Clara. Her defensive reaction when I brought it up was enough to make it clear that she was trying to hide something, and it wasn't just the murder. Miss Marple's voice had softened, and neither had Mrs. Fansor's. Denham looked to the hearth with a mix of jealousy and fear. She had lost everything to her friend and still couldn't let go, even after all these years. It wasn't about money, though. Miss Marple had thrown her hands in her lap. It was about control. Mrs. Fansor had rebuilt her life, but Clara wouldn't let her forget the past. When she worried that Eloise might expose her, she acted, and the letter was her last attempt to assert her dominance. But it ended up bringing her downfall, with Miss Partridge serving as a reluctant accomplice. Upon realizing the threat was past, she was too eager to flee, so she didn't burn the letter out of fear of being implicated either. I should have noticed it sooner after Denham touched his temples. Now it all makes obvious. Denham stepped away. From the window, his gaze softened but resigned, and he asked, "So, what happens now?" Miss Marple offered a subtle smile and said, "Don't be too hard on yourself, Inspector. The truth is often hidden in plain sight. People think they can bury the past, but it always finds its way to the surface. The trick is knowing where to look." He spoke with an air of finality as he asked whether Lady Clara would be arrested. Miss Marple responded simply, but more importantly, she will have to confront the truth about her actions, not only the crime, but also the years of resentment that drove her to it. Meanwhile, Miss Partridge will probably be free from suspicion and will never speak of it again. Denham nodded, his brow furrowed in contemplation. "You never miss a thing, Miss Marple. You knew exactly what to say to make her crack." Miss Marple responded softly, amplifying the silence that had plagued her for so long. Denham glanced at her, his expression shifting from admiration to something more human. "You've solved it, Miss Marple." "I've only listened," she said with a smile. "The people of Fernwood have told me everything. I needed to know as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet village." Miss Marple looked out the window. Once more, it had been a long journey, but the truth had finally come to light, and in Fernwood, where secrets festered. Beneath polite exteriors, that was a rare thing indeed. The silence that called twice, Miss Marple said softly to herself sometimes. It takes more than one knock to bring the truth to the door. Chapter 11. The days after Lady Clara's confession fell like a retreating tide, leaving behind only traces of what was once hidden. Fernwood, as it always did, returned to its gentle rhythm, and the village settles back into its familiar routines as if nothing had happened. But Miss Marple, ever the skeptic, saw through the outward effort. Beneath the surface of that calm, she could feel the undercurrent, a ripple caused by unspoken thoughts, still threads through the village. On a Saturday afternoon, she was back in the market square with her basket. Hearing the soft sounds of the village filled the air. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was heavy with its remains. Miss Partridge's absence had not gone unnoticed, but there was a quiet relief in the air now, as though the villagers had finally let go of the suspicion that had clung to them. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Maisie greeted, offering a smile. "Afternoon, Maisie, how are you today?" Miss Marple softly inquired, "Is everything okay? The house is quiet and peaceful here. I'm not sure what the police plan to do with the contents, but I heard they're clearing out gravestones soon." Maisie's eyes briefly shifted to the postbox, as if contemplating something. With a gentle nod, Miss Marple acknowledged the profound significance of a home. "It's sometimes best to let things remain as they are, Maisie, whether they be memories or secrets." While Maisie watched her with intrigue, Miss Marple remained silent, reasoning that some things were better left unsaid. As she strolled through the village, Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the case. Lady Clara had been arrested and taken to the county jail where she would face trial, but the quiet weight of the truth had lingered in Miss Marple's heart. It wasn't just the murder she had uncovered, it was the realization that the past, no matter how deeply buried, would always come to the surface, and some truths once unearthed could never be forgotten. She turned a corner, her path leading her towards the old churchyard. The vicar had recently mentioned a new grave being prepared, a plot for someone who had passed away in the village, though the details were scarce. Miss Marple knew it was only a matter of time before the last remnants of this case faded into history. The vicarage loomed in the distance, its silhouette softened by the late afternoon light. The windows glimmered like quiet memories, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw the flicker of movement inside. Perhaps the Reverend, or perhaps someone else entirely. As she approached the churchyard, she noticed a lone figure standing by one of the weathered tombstones. It was the Reverend Collier, his expression thoughtful, his hands clasped behind his back. "Good afternoon, Reverend," Miss Marple said, offering a smile. "Ah, Miss Marple," he replied, turning to face her. "It's a quiet day, isn't it? It's hard to see people as they truly are sometimes. We think we know them, but we only know what they let us see. The death of Mrs. Fanshawe has unsettled a great many people." "None of us do," Miss Marple replied. The Reverend sighed, looking over at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He nodded toward the tombstone. Miss Marple said gently, "And sometimes we refuse to see what's right in front of us." They stood there for a while, watching the fading sunlight dance over the gravestones, casting long shadows across the quiet ground. It was a peaceful place, and in that moment Fernwood felt truly still. Even the birds seemed to pause in their songs, as though giving a moment of silence for the secrets that had been revealed. Finally, the Reverend spoke. "Again, I think Mrs. Fanshawe's passing has affected me more than I expected. She was a mystery, even in her silence. Perhaps I should have paid more attention. Perhaps we all should," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute. "But it's never too late to learn." As the wind shifted, whispering through the trees and sending a few fallen leaves tumbling to the ground, Miss Marple believed in a world that could go on, regardless of the number of truths revealed or hidden. And thus, the last chapter of Fernwood's mystery was concluded. The bell had rung twice, the silence had been broken, and yet, as always, there would be other mysteries, other secrets waiting to be found. But for now, Miss Marple would take her leave. She had learned what she needed to learn, and in the quiet of her heart she knew that the truth, while sometimes painful, was always worth finding. With a final glance at the churchyard, Miss Marple turned and made her way home, the soft click of her heels against the cobblestones echoing faintly behind.